Good afternoon. Good afternoon, William. Thank you for coming, finally. The session before tea and post-lunch is when most literature festival audiences suffer from that strange illness now being diagnosed as snoozeitis. So for all of you who are falling asleep, please just wake up so that I can have my 15 seconds of fame in what has been an exciting second day in the third edition of the Hindu Lit for Life. I'm delighted to introduce this session's speaker. He started off as a travel writer and then moved to well-researched historical novels. William Dalrymple's In Xanadu, From the Holy Mountain, The Age of Kali, and The Wonderful City of Jinns, an extraordinary account of the seven-layered life of Delhi through time and space, and then followed it up with his White Mughal, The Last Mughal, and his most recent, The Return of a King, that he's going to share and talk about this afternoon. William has been nominated and won many literary prizes, all of which are in the brochure, so I won't bore you with them. He also co-curates the other literature festival, you know, the one we don't mention here, north of the Vindhyas, often attracting international star speakers because of the weight of his connections. Please join me in welcoming William Dalrymple.
Thank you very much. Could we have the first slide, please? Got it. Just one small correction, Ranveer, before plunging in. Not historical novels. These are not works of fiction. These are works of history. I'd like you to imagine yourselves away from a balmy afternoon in Chennai, away even from the wonderful bright lights of Jaipur, and relocate yourself to a bleak desert road in 1837. We are somewhere between Tehran and Mashhad on the Iranian-Afghan frontier, and a war is about to break out. The new Shah of Persia, Muhammad II Qajar, has made a promise in his coronation speech that he will retake for Iran the disputed great border city of Herat. Herat, the city that ancestrally produced many of the innovations in Timurid architecture that were later perfected here in India with the great Mughals. Muhammad II has moved his army up the road towards Mashhad, and a war is about to break out. For the last month, postboys, infantrymen, cavalrymen, suppliers, clerks have been moving up and down this road ceaselessly. But it's now about 4 a.m. on a winter's night, and it's suddenly very cold, and the road is nearly empty. And if you imagine yourself standing there, coming towards you along the road is a single figure on a horse. And as he comes closer, you can see that he is exhausted, that he's really about to fall off the horse with tiredness. He's been riding for 3-4 days now. He's come all the way from Kermanshah in the far west of Iran, and he's ridden through Tehran right up to the border because he wants to be there to report for the British Embassy in Tehran on the outbreak of hostilities. This is a major moment in the Great Game. The Iranians, supported by the Russians, are about to launch into Afghanistan, and war is about to break out. And even as you look at this guy, you can see he's exhausted. And he eventually, I don't ride, I don't know how long you can sit on a horse fast asleep without falling off it. But at some point, he jerks awake, having fallen into a kind of exhausted coma. And when he wakes, he realizes that he has lost the road. And he and his horse, in the middle of the night, it's now about 2 a.m, are lost in the desert. Now, even today, the borderlands of Afghanistan and Iran are not the kind of place you particularly want to get lost. This is the area which all the heroin coming out towards Europe and America is today smuggled through. But in 1837, even more than today, this is what we call in Scotland debatable land. This is land disputed by two rival powers. And he's understandably nervous. So this young man is a character called Henry Rawlinson. He's about, I think, 22 years old at this point. He's born the year of Waterloo, 1815. His father is a racehorse trainer in Newmarket, so he's grown up in the saddle, he knows how to ride. But he's also, as so was often the case this time, as well as being a Bengal artillery officer, sent by the British to Iran to train up the Persians so that they can fight off the Russians. As well as that, he's also a spy. And he's there to report back to his masters in London exactly what's going on. But despite that, he's obviously extremely nervous because he's lost. It's the middle of the night. And he's very relieved when, I don't know, about 6 in the morning, 4 hours later, the first light of dawn breaks over the Kohi Shah Jahan Mountains. And he can work out suddenly where east is, where west is, and he heads back towards the main military road, hoping he's going to get to the Shah's camp before the war breaks out. And then he sees the thing that he least wants to see. As light begins to grow, he can see quite clearly coming towards him up the valley, blocking him off from the road he's trying to reach again, a party of horse. Now, he doesn't know whether these are Persians heading for Afghanistan, whether they're Afghans heading for Persia, whether they're brigands, drug smugglers, who knows what they are. But it's not the kind of place you want to meet strangers. So what he does is what any of us would do in this situation. He gets off his horse, he hides the horse in a little cave in the rock face, and he hunkers down to see who it is that's coming towards him, hoping that they haven't seen him. And what he sees that morning in 1837, at 6 in the morning, in the first light of dawn, changes the history of Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and also, to a certain extent, India, for the next 50, 60 years. Because what he sees coming towards him, actually, I'm not going to tell you quite yet what he sees coming towards him. I have to wait. So, this is 1837. This is 22 years after Waterloo, and Asia is being disputed between two rival powers. On one hand, you have here in Chennai and in South Asia the British, but not the British government. India is being rapidly conquered and subjected by a public limited company, by a company with accountants, with boardroom lunches, with shareholders, with all the paraphernalia of a normal business, except that it also has the largest standing army in Asia. Since the 1760s, the East India Company has transformed itself. For 150 years, it's been a perfectly normal trading company selling spices, selling silks, buying things in one place, selling in another. But suddenly, about 1760, here in Madras, they changed the nature of the company. Clive trains up sepoys, and he suddenly realizes that by using training Indians in modern European infantry techniques, and particularly modern techniques of artillery, that they can conquer great swathes of territory. And this is accelerated at the arrival of Marquis Wesley at the very end of the 18th century. And by 1837, the British have conquered or subjected or signed into treaty all of India up into the Punjab, up into the Sutlej. Everything to the south of the Sutlej is either directly ruled or by treaty in alliance with the company. At the same time as this is happening, using exactly the same technology, the Russians are moving southwards at a rate of 100 miles a decade since the time of Peter the Great. And if you look at a map, as any old buffer sitting in a club in Pall Mall or an officer's mess in St. Petersburg can do, it's very clear that these two enormous, aggressive European empires using new 18th century advances in artillery technology are just conquering Asia between them. The French are being kicked out of the field, out of the contest at Waterloo. Napoleon's sitting on St. Helena in exile. And the Russians and this monstrous company, there's no modern equivalent of the East India Company. It's, think, I don't know, Halliburton with nuclear weapons, or, I don't know, Pepsi-Cola with nuclear submarines or something, to give an equivalent of the East India Company. So the East India Company and the Russians are eating up Asia between them. And anyone can see that decade by decade, they're getting closer to each other. That as the British are moving rapidly north and westwards, and the Russians are moving south and eastwards, that at some point in the future, if this trajectory continues, they're going to meet in the middle. And the place that they're going to meet is the country that we today call Afghanistan. Although at this point, there is no such place as Afghanistan. There are Afghans, but it's a patchwork of different principalities, fragments of other empires. And any Al-Buffer can see that at some point they're going to come together, but they're still quite far apart, which is why what Rawlinson sees on that morning in Persia in 1837 matters. Because what he sees is not a drug smuggler, it's not the Afghans, it's not the Persians. What he sees, hidden in his cave, hoping that his horse isn't going to whinny or give him away, is he sees a troop of fully armed Russian Cossack imperial cavalry who have traveled, he doesn't know this, but they have traveled through Persia in disguise, but they've just cast off their disguise and got into their full-dress uniform because they've left the military road and think no one will observe them. He sees this party moving up the valley, heading directly into Afghanistan. And for strategists and spies and intelligence workers of the 1830s, this is the weapons of mass destruction of its day. This is the golden bullet, because it provides evidence to the hawks who want to go into Afghanistan that the Russians are actually interested in it. Up to that point, though, there have been many hawkish strategists who've been saying, forget the Sikhs in the Punjab, send an army right into Afghanistan, get there before the Russians do, we can take it over, we'll have the crossroads of Asia, we can trade between Persia and China, we can trade between Central Asia and India. All we have to do is seize that highland. But no one has actually coughed up the money to do it or given credibility to the project because it still seems pie in the sky, because it still seems almost impossible that the Russians will get far south enough that it is a real threat. Suddenly, though, with the sight of a Russian cavalry unit heading into Afghanistan, everything changes. The game is up. And the hawks in Calcutta and in London seize the opportunity that this provides in order to create a war when none is necessary. And so begins one of the great imperial catastrophes, one of the most ludicrous wars ever fought, one of the most costly wars ever fought for the British Empire. The British have an asset, and it's this man, Shah Shuja-ul-Mulk. 30 years earlier, Shah Shuja, who is the grandson of the great Ahmed Shah Durrani, who defeats the Marathas in Panipat in the 1760s. The grandson, like so many in these situations, not interested in war like his grandfather. He's into roses, he likes poetry, he has a wonderful way with couplets, he writes beautiful memoirs, but he can't win a battle. And by the age of 21, he's lost what remains of the Durrani Empire, being kicked out by a far more aggressive figure, Amir Dost Muhammad. And he has arrived in Lahore, where Ranjit Singh takes from him a certain diamond called the Koh-i-Noor, that now sits in the Queen Mother's crown in London. And poor old Shah Shuja ends up in Ludhiana completely penniless. He has no money, no assets, nothing. And the East India Company take him in, not out of charity, but because they're aware that one day this guy can be of use to them. And suddenly, with this knowledge that the Russians are heading into Afghanistan, Shah Shuja suddenly becomes, after 30 years, terribly important. Because the British can invade Afghanistan, claiming to be putting the legitimate ruler back on the throne again. It's the old game of regime change that's still being played today. This is the gentleman who is leading the Russian party. Fascinating character called Ivan Vikkovich, originally from Lithuania, originally an anti-Tsarist, who'd been sent into exile, having been caught writing anti-Russian slogans on the blackboard in his school. Age 14, he's given a life sentence and a punishment posting on the steppe, and his only way of escaping from this horror is to learn the languages of the steppe and become an agent for the people that have wrecked his lives. So this anti-Russian activist becomes a pro-Russian spy. And he is sent in on an unofficial mission in 1837 to scout out the possibility of opening diplomatic relations with Dost Muhammad. And that is actually all it is. It's not a Russian invasion of Afghanistan. It's not even necessarily the opening of a formal alliance between Russia and Afghanistan. Nonetheless, the sighting of the Russians going in is enough for the Hawks, and they spin it in a way that would, of course, be completely impossible today. Can you imagine that a group of ideologically driven hawks could create an unnecessary war? It couldn't possibly happen in such a situation in modern politics, but it happens in 1837. This piece of intelligence is manipulated, the dodgy dossier is created, and by 1839, the company is preparing to send into the field the largest army that it has sent into action since the army left Madras in 1799 to take on Tipu Sultan, whose cannon I just saw in the museum half an hour ago. So the army of the Indus is sent up to... This is Alexander Burns, who's the young British intelligence officer who opposes the war. He's sitting in Kabul and he knows that Amir Dost Muhammad is actually perfectly capable of signing an alliance with the British. But he's ignored because he's too successful. His old buffer superiors don't trust him. They think he's too young, too brash, too inexperienced, and they ignore his advice. And they go to war anyway. And Burns, who is indeed extremely ambitious, is effectively bought off with the promise of being the deputy governor of Afghanistan. So he drops his objections and he joins this ill-fated expedition. This is Ranjit Singh, who rules the Sikh Khalsa, more or less on the lines where modern Pakistan is, from Peshawar, but it doesn't have Karachi. It goes only as far as the southern Punjab, but it does also have, briefly, Kashmir. So Ranjit Singh is far too wily to be drawn into this war. The British want permission to pass through his Punjab and in order to invade through the Khyber Pass up to Peshawar. And for the British, this would be only a 2-week march from Ludhiana. Set off from Ludhiana in 2 weeks, you're in Peshawar, and you can invade Afghanistan with more or less fresh troops. Ranjit Singh will have nothing of it. He realizes that if the British take Afghanistan, obviously the next thing is to gobble up the Punjab. So he blocks them. And this expedition, which has now already gone too far to be cancelled, troops have been called up, money's been spent, supplies have been commissioned, all the normal paraphernalia of war, the generals have got all excited. So this ridiculous expedition now has to take a 4,000-mile detour. Has to go from Ludhiana right down through the deserts of Baluchistan and up the Bolan Pass from Quetta and up through the back end to Kandahar, which is a much longer and much, much more difficult route because it's also the height of summer now, and you'll have to pass through the deserts of Baluchistan in midsummer. But it's too late to stop this thing now. The momentum has got up, and so the army of the Indus is gathered in Firozpur. And the army consists of 14,000 East India Company sepoys, 6,000 irregulars, 21,000 troops in all, accompanied by 38,000 camp followers. They march off to war with 30,000 camels. One brigadier needs 50 camels to carry his uniforms, while the general needs 260 with his camp baths and all that kind of stuff. There are 300 camels which carry nothing but the regimental wine cellar. There are 30 camels that carry nothing but cheroots and cigar, and one camel goes all the way to Afghanistan carrying nothing but eau de cologne. for the officers. And you can see this sort of extraordinary thing. There's camels with the mess plate. There's guys trying to cross the river. There are sheep being herded for people to eat. There's the treasure going on a bullock cart. There's the munshi who has to translate or negotiate with the emirs on the way. There's prisoners who've been caught stealing things from the supplies. This whole enormous cavalcade sets off down, first of all down the Indus. Then they have to get out of there and march across the desert. And the only thing they haven't brought, they brought their wine, they brought their cheroots, they brought their eau de cologne. The only thing they don't have is a map, because they haven't got one. So soon they're completely lost. You can see these guys going into these narrow passes. And this is a very familiar sort of South Asian situation. You can just see these guys saying, which way to Afghanistan? They say, "Seedhe jai, just go straight." And here they are, crowds of them, heading in every conceivable direction except Afghanistan. And the guys have misdirected them smirking here at the bottom. And there are people sniping at them. And the whole thing is a catastrophe. They don't know where the water is. They haven't got the ropes necessary to pull things up mountainside. Camels go careering down into valleys. Guns explode. Most of all, the poor camp followers, who no one is looking after, haven't got water. And about 40% of them die of thirst crossing the deserts of Baluchistan in midwinter. Meanwhile, the sepoys are crossing because of a delay. They've set off in their winter uniforms, thick serge, meant to keep you warm in the cold winters of UP or Delhi. And they're crossing Baluchistan in their winter uniforms in thick serge, and they're just suffocating and falling dead from exhaustion. Nonetheless, such is the momentum that most of them, soldiers, and 60% of the camp followers, do make it through. And by the following November, they've got as far as Kandahar. And the rulers of Kandahar take one sight at this ragged expedition, and they flee. And Shah Shuja is able to walk into the tomb of Ahmad Shah Durrani, his grandfather, which is still there today, modeled very much on Safdarjung's tomb in Delhi. And he goes and seeks the barakat of his grandfather. Next up comes Ghazni. And luckily, the British intelligence have stepped in and say, "Look, chaps, we've got our latest man on the job here in Ghazni, and there are no walls in Ghazni. You can leave the cannons behind." So the cannons, which have been hauled all the way over the Bolan Pass and through all the mountains on the way into Afghanistan, are left behind in Kandahar. And they arrive in Ghazni to find, in fact, that it only doesn't have walls. They are, in fact, the largest walls in Central Asia. And they've got no cannon. The cannon are 2 weeks behind them in Kandahar. Still, some gallant chap promises to blow up the front gates, and in they march. They arrive at lunchtime, and realizing that they either be as bold as they can or they just have to go back and give up, they decide just to blow up the front gate that night. And on arrival at 6 o'clock at sunset, there is a feint attack at the back, and then the real attack goes in the front. And they capture it in one night. Within 2 weeks, Amir Dost Muhammad has fled to Bukhara, and Shah Shuja is reinstalled in the Bala Hisar of Kabul. Almost not a single soldier has been killed in bloodshed. They've lost people who've got lost, who've died of thirst, but there's been virtually no casualties from only about 50 casualties on the attack in Ghazni, and about 20 lost through sniping in Baluchistan. So from the British point of view, this is the most fantastic success. And they're all pretty smug, because everyone said it would be almost impossible to do, and they've done it with virtually no casualties. So everyone is very pleased with themselves. Knighthoods all round, everybody gets promoted. There's big parties thrown in Calcutta and London. And in that smugness is sowed all the seeds of everything which goes wrong in the months ahead. Now, even the incredibly dim regimental chaplain, who's a man called the Reverend Gleig, realizes that the plains outside Kabul are not one of the great defensive positions. And this is where the British, as if they were just outside Chennai or just outside Calcutta, they just park their tents and build a cantonment. They don't build a fortress, they don't build walls. In due course, they dig a few ditches around the cantonment and they put up a wooden palisade around it. But it is not a defensive position. And even the dim regimental chaplain can see it's surrounded by hills on all sides. This is not a position which is going to be defended if the Afghans actually rise up and test their strength. But no one's thinking about that. Shah Shuja brings his family up from Ludhiana. Dost Muhammad escapes from Bukhara and surrenders. And it all looks as if it's going to be completely easy. The Memsahibs are brought up from the plains. Lady Sale arrives in Kabul with her grand piano, her unmarried daughter, and her seeds from her kitchen garden in Agra. And she writes, the following spring, my sweet peas and geraniums were much admired, and in the kitchen garden, the potatoes especially thrive. There's cricket and horse racing and open-air amateur theatricals, and as winter draws in, snipe and duck shooting and skating and snowman building. One regiment has brought a pack of foxhounds. They're taken out hunting. Alexander Burns, who we saw earlier, decides to throw a Christmas party in his kilt and his sporran. And already there's talk about moving moving the summer capital from Simla to Kabul, so as to do what the Mughals did, which is to rule India in the summer from Afghanistan. Everyone, for the time being, doesn't even notice how incredibly incompetent the main governor is. Burns writes in his diary, Paul Macnaghten, this man Henry Macnaghten, who you see taking the surrender here in his top hat, Paul Macnaghten should never have left the secretary's office. He's ignorant of men, even to simplicity, and utterly incapable of forming and guiding administrative measures. The judicial line would probably have suited him best, and even then only in the Court of Appeal, judging only written evidence. So he's not a very bright spark. But no one notices this for the time being. And then, of course, things begin slowly to go wrong. And the reason they go wrong is that the British discover what everyone else has discovered whenever they've conquered Afghanistan, is there's absolutely nothing there to exploit. If you conquer Madras, you can run off with all the money, all the merchants here. If you run the Punjab, you can tax all the farmers. But as Dost Muhammad says when he surrenders, he surrenders to Macnaghten and says, here's my sword, but tell me, sir, why have you come here? This is a land of only stones and men. And this is what the British find. They find that the cost of administering Afghanistan and the cost of garrisoning it and putting little garrisons in every valley, guarding every pass, is hugely more expensive than any money that they can possibly make by controlling the trade routes. So what looked like a very good idea on paper is rapidly shown to be catastrophic. And the East India Company is a company. It's there to make money. Originally, it made tons of money by buying up the silks and the brocades and the spices of India and selling them in London. By the 1830s, the trade that they have is growing opium. Anyone who's read the Amitav Ghosh books, they grow opium in UP, they sell it to the Chinese, they buy tea in China, and they sell that in London. So it's a triangular trade, but it's a pretty fragile profit because they have to administer India. They have to garrison it. And the costs of administering and garrisoning India is only just slightly less than the profits that they make from the opium and the tea trade. So there's not much slack. And Afghanistan, they discover after 1 year, shoves them into the red. They're suddenly losing money rather than making it. The whole edifice of the East India Company, rather than making a fortune, is actually losing it. So what they do, of course, they have to cut. So they cut back all the troops. And again, this couldn't happen today. Can you imagine people invading Afghanistan, then immediately going off and invading somewhere else? Couldn't happen today. But in this time, they go off and invade not Iraq, but they go off and invade Hong Kong. And in 1842, 1841, there are the Opium Wars. And the troops are pulled out of Afghanistan, and they leave only a token garrison in 3 places: in Kabul, in Kandahar, and Jalalabad. And then they make the fatal mistake of breaking their promise to the border tribes. Now, in later Raj myth, there was also a thing, they realized that the one thing you don't do is you don't mess with the Pathans. He said, thrash the Sindhis, went the doggerel, beat the Baluch, but just pay the bloody Pathans. And this is what everyone has always done. Nadir Shah, going in to raid Mughal Delhi in 1739, pays the Afridis and the Ghilzais on his way into India, and he pays them again on his way out. And that way he can get the Peacock Throne and all the other goodies he's pinched from India, including the Kohinoor, back out of India. And the Pathans have a very simple code. If you pay them the right amount and you stick to your word, they'll leave you alone. If you don't, you're fair game. So Macnaghten calls in the Ghilzais' elders in 1841, October, and says, look, chap, we've just got our sums wrong. We promised we'd pay you 60 lakh for keeping for keeping Radari, the road tax, keeping the passes open. Sorry, perhaps we haven't got the money. You can have 10 lakh. In other words, he cuts 4/5 of their salaries. They go home. The next day, the post boys are found dead with their throats slit, and no post arrives. No soldiers pass through. Nothing moves. The Ghilzais have shut it down. And the British are stuck in their 3 garrisons. They're not only not getting the post from India, they're not even getting words from the outlying garrisons in Kandahar and Jalalabad. And they realize overnight that they've made an error, but it's too late to do anything about it. And suddenly, their weakness is exposed. And at this particular moment, Burns, brilliant mind, good writer, funny, attractive guy, judged the situation exactly right, realized this whole expedition was ridiculous, but ambitious enough to be bought off with the promise of a knighthood and a deputy governorship. Classic politician stuff. So Burns has got bored because Macnaghten's doing all the administrating, and he chooses this particular moment to go and seduce this girl, who is the girlfriend of one of the leading nobles at the court. This is a mistake. The guy whose girlfriend has been seduced is a man called Abdullah Khan Achaksai. He gathers his friends. I don't know what happens in Chennai when this sort of thing happens. Maybe somebody throws stones through a window and, it's all forgotten. But it doesn't go that way in Afghanistan. He gets his friends and he makes a speech. He says, according to Ms. Atta, it happened by God's will that a slave girl of Abdullah Khan Achaksai ran away from the residence of that man to the house of Alexander Burns. When on inquiry it was found that that was where she had gone, the Khan, beside himself with fury, sent his servant to fetch the silly girl back. But the Englishman, swollen with pride, cursing and swearing, had the Khan's attendants severely beaten and thrown out the house. The Khan then summoned the other Sardars and said, now we are justified in throwing off the English yoke. They stretch the hand of tyranny to dishonor private citizens, great and small. Making love to a slave girl isn't worth the ritual bath you have to have afterwards. But we have to put a stop to this right now, right here. Otherwise, and this is the key quote, otherwise these English will drive the donkey of their desires into the field of stupidity. Well, we've all done that in our time, but not a good idea to do it in Kabul. I put my trust in God and raise the battle standard of the Prophet. And we go out to fight. If success rewards us, it is as we wished. If we die in battle, it is better than to live with degradation and dishonor. And the other Sardars, his childhood friends, tightened their belts and girt their loins and prepared for jihad. So what happens is that night, they go to the house of Alexander Burns, they kill his bodyguards, they start a fire, Burns rushes out, dressed in Afghan kit, they catch him, they cut off his head, they play football with his head, then they hang up the body on a butcher's hook in the bazaar. By dawn, there are 300 people gathered, ready to go and attack the British cantonment. By the following evening, it's grown to about 6,000. It's grown to 100,000 by the end of the month. The whole of Afghanistan realizes that the British have been caught with their pants down, metaphorically and literally, and they gather in Kabul and prepare to make mincemeat. Poor old Macnaghten goes out in his top hat and blue-tinted spectacles, and he's shot dead by the negotiating team. The British have very cleverly kept all their supplies in 2 forts, which they leave with only 10 sepoys guarding the food and the ammunition right next to the old city of Kabul. If you look at this slide, you can see that the tents we saw earlier, 3 years later, are still sitting there in the valley. They haven't built They haven't built proper fortifications at all. There are a few barrack blocks that have gone up. There's half a wall here, but it remains a pretty well indefensible valley floor that's not even surrounded by a proper palisade. And there is the old city of Kabul there. So the Afghans are gathering there, and they capture, within 24 hours, the two forts full of the British arms and the British food. And so the British have no ammunition, and it's winter, they've got no fuel, and they've got no food. So first of all, they eat the foxhounds, then they eat their horses, then they eat the rats, then they starve. Meanwhile, the Afghans take the British guns, they haven't got their own, and they pull them up onto a hill and fire down onto the cantonment below. And obviously, this is not going to work. This is not going to last. Nor is the British general in charge much use. This is William Elphinston. William Elphinston, General Elphinston, gets onto his horse, he falls off his horse, the horse falls on him, and that's the end of Elphinston. So by November, it's not looking good for the defenders. This proud army that had marched in against all the odds, taken Afghanistan in 48 hours, not in 48 hours, in a single season, in 48 hours is found to be without food, without arms, surrounded on all sides, cut off from India, and it's winter. Winter is coming. The first snows have come in, and it is the coldest winter for 40 years. By the end of November, snow is sort of 6 foot high outside the walls in some drifts, and a thick deposit lies all around. The whole thing is iced over. Lady Sale eventually decides to chop up her piano for firewood. It's so desperate. And they surrender. There's no option. They fight until December, and then they try and make some sort of deal. And the Afghans actually give them quite a good deal. The deal is that they're allowed to walk out with their weapons, with their small arms, not their guns, not their artillery, with their small arms, with their colours. They're allowed to retreat. They don't have to surrender. They're not taken hostage. But the trouble is, everyone knows that whatever the nobles say in Kabul, whatever Dost Muhammad and his son Akbar Khan say, that whatever they say, that the Ghilzai, who didn't get their money, are waiting in the passes. And these guys, they know, lie between them and Kabul. And no one imagines this is going to be much of a picnic. So on the 6th of January, 1842, what's left of the army of the Indus retreats from Kabul. The engineer blows away the whole front wall of the palisade, and the army marches out over the Kabul River. And in the lead is my great-great-uncle, a man called Colin Mckenzie. This is what he writes. At 9 a.m., the troops moved off. A crouching, drooping, dispirited army, so different from the smart, light-hearted body of men they appeared so recently. The men sinking a foot deep in the snow with each step. My heart sunk within me under the conviction that we were a doomed force. I always remember as one of the most heart-rending sights of that humiliating day, fixing my eyes by chance on a little Hindustani child, perfectly naked, sitting in the snow, with no mother or father near her. She was a beautiful little girl, about 2 years old, just strong enough to sit upright with her little legs doubled underneath her, hair curling in waving locks beneath her soft little throat, and her great black eyes dilated to twice their normal size, fixed on the armed men, the passing cavalry, and the strange sights that met her gaze. Many other children as young and innocent as her I saw slain on the road, and women with their long dark hair wet with their own blood. The rear guard had to fight the whole way to the camping ground at Bagrami and pass through a literally continuous line of poor wretches, men, women, and children, dead or dying from colds or the wounds, who, unable to move, entreated their comrades to kill them and put an end to their misery. So the British amazingly managed to then go and do exactly what they've done already. They don't guard their commissariat. So first out is the the cavalry. The cavalry pass on with Lady Sale riding among them. Next up comes the infantry. Last comes the baggage carriers and the baggage. And of course, the Afghans who've been waiting in the old city see that the cavalry and infantry have moved off, and they just land on the baggage. So the tents are captured, the food is captured, and the ammunition is captured again. And so by 6 o'clock, the cavalry arrive at the camping ground and say, "Where's my bearer? Where's my bath? Where's the tent?" No bearer, no bath, no tent. By 10 o'clock, it's minus 15 or something, 16. And still no tent, still no bearer, still no bath. By 10 o'clock, it's quite clear that they're not coming, that all the baggage has been lost, all the tents have been lost, all the food has been lost. And at 10 o'clock, suddenly there's an enormous orange inferno on the horizon, and they realize that the cantonments have been set on fire, that they're looting the cantonments. So these guys are now sitting in the snow, a day's march outside Kabul, the 6 days more through the Gilzai valleys ahead of them. It's thick winter, it's full winter, thick snow. They haven't got any food, they can't go back because their cantonments are on fire. They're screwed. But some of them at least have some idea of how to save themselves. Colin Mckenzie is with his Jezailchis, who are the Afghans who've been recruited into the company service. They have the long-barreled Jezails, which the Afghans fight with. And they know what to do. The Afghans, who are used to winter warfare, have little tiny spades, like trowels, which they strap to their sides. They have meal, which they keep in their so they start making porridge. And using their trowels, they dig foxholes for themselves. Big circles, about 15 feet wide. They pull all the snow out. They build a fire in the middle. And they snuggle down body to body, using their body heat to keep them warm. And they cover themselves with their cloaks and their turbans, all that they can do, and put a fire in the middle. And they sit like the clock, figures of a clock face or the petals of a flower with their feet facing in at the fire. It's not a very comfy way to spend a night, but at least they wake up the following morning. The poor Hindustanis who have been recruited from Bihar, from Bengal, from UP, particularly UP around Lucknow, have never even seen snow before. They haven't got the right kit, they have no idea what to do, so they just go and lie down on the snow. The following morning, they wake up, they look down, and their feet are black with frostbite. It's gone to minus 40 in the night. And they can't walk, their hands are black, they can't pull the triggers. And at this point, the leader of the Afghan resistance, Wazir Akbar Khan, comes up from behind and drives them like a herd of sheep into the Kabul Pass, which is the big pass that leads from Kabul down towards Jalalabad. Lady Sale is in the front with Skinner's horse, who are leading the forecaст. The confusion, she said, was fearful. We had not proceeded half a mile when we were heavily fired upon. The pony my daughter rode was wounded in the ear and the neck. Then there's a lovely bit of sort of Victorian understatement. I fortunately had only one musket ball in my arm. 3 others passed through my poshteen near the shoulder without doing me any injury. The pass completely choked up, and for a considerable period we were stationary under heavy fire. That night, the sepoys and camp followers, half frozen, tried to force their way not only into our tent, but into our beds. Many poor wretches died around the tent that night. Many women and children were abducted. The following day after that, they have to climb up to the highest point in the retreat, the Tezeen Pass. And there, this entire army, which has only 3 tents between them, no food, they still haven't eaten. Lady McNaughton has somehow got a bottle of sherry, which has frozen to the consistency of treacle. Up at the top of the Tezeen Pass, at the highest point, they get caught in the mother of all blizzards. So, there are, let me get the figure right. They set off from Kabul with 4,500 troops, of whom 700 are Brits, the rest are Biharis and Lucknawis, and 12,000 camp followers. So there's 18,500. By the end of the first night, it's gone down to about 14,000. By the time they got up to the top of the Tezeen Pass, it's down to 10,000. On the way down, the Gilzai prepare an ambush at a place called Jagdalik. They wait for the narrowest point in the path, they block it with thorns and hedges, and then they prepare lines of entrenchments above from which they snipe down. The Brits hit it about 6 in the evening. and only 300 make it over the hedge. It's gone down from 18,500 to 15,000, 15,000 to 12,000 to 5,000 to 300. And the 300 who are left have something like 150 bullets between them, 150 rounds between them. They are exposed on the hill of Gandamak at dawn. And they fire their last bullets. They then do a couple of cavalry charges, and the Afghans just pull back and snipe at them from a distance. One man survives, this guy, because he's put the regimental colours around him, and everyone assumes he's rich and worth ransoming. 15 horsemen make it through to the Shah Jahan's gardens at Nimla. These are gorgeous gardens, like the Shalimar Gardens, built by Shah Jahan at the peak of the Mughal Empire, still maintained with their cypresses and their chinars and everything, and their lovely irrigation runnels. The Malis are there. Malis offer them must and naan, bread and yogurt, and they get off their horses, and then the Malis clobber them with their spades. One man out of the 18,500 makes it through to Jalalabad. The whole of the rest of the army has either been slaughtered or captured or enslaved. And this is particularly the fate of most of the poor Hindustanis. If they haven't been frostbitten, most of them die of frostbite or crippled by the frostbite. But if they're still able-bodied, the Ghilzais sell them off to Uzbek slave traders. And the Uzbeks have a particularly unpleasant way with their slaves. They take a horsehair rope and a carpet needle, and they thread it through the clavicle of their captive's torso. They then tie your hands behind your back, and they tie the rope that's attached to your clavicle to the horse. So if you don't keep up with your captor, you're stumbling around with your hands behind your back. If you don't keep up with your captor, your whole sort of chest cavity is ripped open. Nonetheless, 2,000 sepoys make it through to the slave markets of Bukhara, where they're sold off. So it is a complete and utter catastrophe. It is the worst imperial defeat of the 19th century, as from the British point of view. Lady Sale, who's taken captive, writes how we came across many bloody scenes as we were being led back to Kabul. Sepoys and camp followers being stripped and plundered on all sides. And such as refused to give up their money and valuables were instantly stabbed or cut down. On seeing us, the poor creatures cried out for help, many of them recognizing me and calling me by name, but what could we do? The Ghilzais had now tasted blood and showed their tigerish nature, becoming very savage and fierce, demanding that we be given up to them for sacrifice, brandishing their long, blood-stained knives in their faces and saying, "Look on these heaps of carcasses around you, for you shall soon be among them." You came to Kabul for fruit, did you?" they asked. They jeered. "How do you like it now?" As we proceeded, we met large numbers of the enemy's horse and foot returning laden with plunder of all kinds. One miscreant had a little Indian girl seated on the horse beside him. So for the Brits, this is catastrophe. But for the Afghans, this is their big national victory. What the Easter Rising is to the Irish, what Gandhi and the freedom struggle is to you, what Bannockburn is to the Scots, this is to the Afghans. And Wazir Akbar Khan, who led this resistance, has the whole diplomatic enclave of Kabul named after him today. Shah Shuja is remembered as the Quisling, which is not good news for his direct tribal descendant, who's a man called Hamid Karzai. And Karzai we put the same guy in twice. Brilliant. It didn't work well the first time, so do it again. And Karzai has to live with this legacy of being Shah Shuja's descendant, which is why, at every instance, despite taking American money, he has to slag off the Americans to the Afghans at every opportunity, which has played this very difficult double game of being entirely dependent on America while publicly opposing them at every... it's a ridiculous position to be in, and yet it sort of somehow works. So for the Afghans, this is still remembered as their big national victory. But for India, this, of course, is a lesson that the Brits can be defeated, and it is the regiments which are in Afghanistan in 1842 which go up into revolt first in Meerut on the 11th of May, 1857. And this is a direct linkage between what happens here now and what happens in North India in 1857. It is said that 60,000 English troops came from Bengal, says Mirza Atta, the main Afghan historian. Only a handful came back, wounded and destitute. The rest fell with neither grave nor shroud to cover them, and lay in that land like rotting donkeys. For the English love gold and money so much that they cannot stop themselves from laying their hands on any area productive of wealth. But what prize did they find in Afghanistan, except on one hand the exhausting of their treasury, and on the other hand the disgracing of their army? It is said that 40,000 English troops had been to Kabul, and that many died en route. Others remained as cripples and beggars in the city. And the rest perished in the mountains, like a ship sunk without trace. For it is no easy thing to invade and occupy the kingdom of Khorasan. Just a concluding word. When I was retracing this story and coming to write it, it seemed to me I had to do two things in Afghanistan. One was to try and gather all the Afghan sources. And it turned out, of course, that this being the great Afghan victory, there were tons of stuff which no one had used. There were 4 full-length epic poems. There were 3 or 4 later court histories. There were letters of many of the resistance leaders. All this stuff was sitting around in Kabul, in Dari, ready to be used. Well known to all the Afghan historians, but as is so often the case with history in this part of the world, you have one stream of historiography that references its own language in English, and another stream in Dari that only references Dari stuff. And so it was quite easy to go to Kabul and get all the Dari material and bring it back. The other thing that was slightly more tricky, though, was getting to do the route of the retreat, because by 2009, when I began work on this, already most of Afghanistan was pretty ropey as far as security was concerned. And while Kabul was very easy to go to, it was rather like a sort of French finishing school full of gorgeous French girls on their year off and sort of nice, handsome Italian archaeologists digging up Buddhist remains. You only had to go about 5 miles outside Kabul, and it was a kind of no man's land. Anyway, I had a lucky break. I got introduced to one of the tribal chieftains who was part of the government, just come in, left the Taliban, joined Karzai, and he was from the village of Jagdalik, which was right where the Holly Hedge was. So he offered to take me with him. And I went with him down to Jagdalik, and I wanted him to take me on to Gandamak. Gandamak, the most tricky place of all, where the British had their last stand, this scene. That hill behind is Tora Bora, scene of a more recent last stand. It's the heart of Taliban territory. So we went off and we bumped out of Kabul, past the route of the cantonment, which now, of course, is the American embassy. They put it literally on the site of the old cantonment, in the same indefensible position, and it's shared with the Italian embassy, but otherwise it's exactly on the same site. And down the Tezin Pass, so through the Kabul, up the Tezin Pass, down to Jagdalik. And there we had to stop because all Jagdalik's people came out when they saw him, and an enormous feast was put on. They put carpets down in a lovely apricot grove, kebabs were grilled, enormous amounts of food were produced. And others have been defeated by the Afghans in different ways. I was defeated on this particular expedition by the amount I had to eat. It was the most enormous thing, and we never got to Gandamak. Just as well, it turned out, because that night it was about 5 o'clock by the time this enormous feast was finished, and we had to go down the main road to Jalalabad. On arrival there, we found that Gandamak, which had been completely safe for the previous, not safe, but had been completely without violence for 6 months, had that very afternoon had an enormous battle taking place on this very hill. The government had sent out the guys to burn the poppy crop. And the locals who had had this happen to them the year before had the Taliban brought in to fight them. So there'd been an enormous battle at 9 in the morning. And the police who'd come to dig up the crop and to burn it had been ambushed as they came into the village. 9 vehicles were blown up. 90 policemen were taken hostage and about 10 were killed. So there'd been this huge battle. Had we turned up at 4 o'clock, as we planned to, I probably wouldn't be standing here before you telling the story now. Luckily, however, thanks to my gluttony and that of my host, we survived. And the following day, there was a parley, because the people of Gundamuk had hostages. They had 90 policemen in their hands. So they brought them in, and Jagdalik, my tribal chieftain who I'd been with, was called in to be the negotiator. So Jagdalik met with the government officials from Kandahar and the elders from Gundamuk, and they had a parley on a hill just above Jalalabad airport. And as we sat there, we could see these very sinister drones taking off from Jalalabad. Jalalabad airport is the main base of the drone operations. They're controlled from wherever, Cape Canaveral or Florida or God knows where. But the actual things take off, the actual aircraft take off mainly from Jalalabad, a few sites in Pakistan too. And so these things were buzzing around us as we were sitting there on the parley. And at the end, the elders of Gundamuk came up, and Jagdalik introduced them, and he made a great joke about how they'd taken my great-uncle hostage 200 years, and they all laughed about that. But I said, do you see any similarity? Is this, ring any bells from 1842? And they said, ring any bells? It's exactly the same. Both times the foreigners come here for their own interests, not for ours. They say, we are your friends, we want to help, but they are lying. Whoever comes to Afghanistan, even now, they will face the fate of Burns and McNaughton. And what was interesting to me was that no one today in Britain or here in India remembers these names, Burns and McNaughton. A few travel enthusiasts may read Alexander Burns' Journey to Bukhara. Otherwise, it's more or less dead history. But the Afghans all know this. This is their they know it like you know Gandhi, Nehru, Sardar Patel, and all the rest of it. This is the story they are taught in school. They are taught by their grandfathers. This is their national founding myth. And the elders sat there and they chatted. They said, we are the roof of the world. From here you can control and watch everywhere. Afghanistan is like a crossroads for every nation that comes to power. But we do not have the strength to control our own destinies. Our fate is always determined by our neighbors. Then one of them told me a story. He said, last month, some Americans came and called us to a hotel in Jalalabad for a meeting. One of them asked me, why do you hate us? And I replied, because you blow down our doors, enter our houses, pull our women by the hair, and kick our children. We cannot accept this. We will fight back, and we will break your teeth. And once your teeth are broken, you will leave, just as the British and the Russians left before you. It's just a matter of time. I said, what did the Americans say to that? He turned to his friend and said, well, if the old men are like this, what will the younger ones be like? In truth, all the Americans here know their game is over. It's just their politicians who deny it. This, he said, is the last days of the Americans. Next, it will be China. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, William. That was absolutely wonderful. You made it all come alive and made history absolutely sexy and like a Merchant Ivory movie,
But not
If
fiction.
only we had so many Dalrymples as history teachers, there might be more history students and we might perceive history in different ways and have many more learnings. I'm just going to do one or two questions, then we'll open it up. What made you, what I perceive as the original history boy? What was it from travel writing? How did you get to history?
I've always been interested in history, and I think either you're born with an interest in history or not. It's like train spotting. If you're not interested in train spotting, no one's going to understand why you sit in a railway station looking at railway engines. Or if you're not interested in plants, people have their own interests. I, from the age of 7, was first time I ever went to London from Scotland. I begged my mother to take me to the Tutankhamun exhibition. It's just, I think, how you're brought up. I had a wonderful Scottish nanny who told me, there had a book called Tales of Scottish Keeps and Castles. There were tales of knights and armour and all that kind of stuff, and it was wonderful. And she was Scots-Irish, and the English were always the villains. So I remember the first time I went to London, it was like sort of going to sort of Germany or something. It was sort of a place I'd always heard was the ancestral enemy. But I started off as a travel writer, and I really the travel books are full of history, and I suppose these books are full of a sense of place. So it's just juggling the pack in a slightly different way. But I think when my kids were born, suddenly the urge to travel went a bit, and I started writing history books rather than travel books. Now that they're on the verge of being grown up, I may go back to travel again.
But having said that, all your history books are so incredibly well researched. Could you share with us some of that process? How much time it takes you? How do you get this sort of multiple pieces of information? You shared some of what happened during the making of this book, but some of your earlier books and all of that as well.
Well, the trick, I mean, I've done the same trick 3 times, really, which is to try and take a well-known story that's been told many times. I try to find, the trick in a sense is to find something that's tight, a tight story. I mean, any novel is rarely set over more than a year or two. You know, it has a small cast of characters. If you can find a story that's big and important but involves a relatively concentrated time frame that has a small cast of characters you can actually follow through this drama, you can write history that reads like a novel, but is actually, entirely factual. You're not, you don't say the sun is shining unless you have a letter saying it was a sunny day that day. You haven't got the freedom of a historical novelist. But the key, in these 3 books, White Moguls, Last Mogul, and Return of the King, was to find, this story has been told many, many times before. Most recently, and most wonderfully, anyone that hasn't read it, Peter Hopkirk's Great Game is a wonderful beginner for this whole tale, the whole story of the rivalry for the Himalayas. But to try and find one of those, and then find the other side of the story. So in Delhi, there was all the mutiny papers from 1857. In Kabul, there was all the Afghan sources for this. Also in Pakistan, there was a huge amount of wonderful stuff in the Punjab archives in Lahore. Other good stuff in Delhi, in the National Archives. And all this stuff is here. Then you have to find a way of organizing it and processing it. I have a method I was taught by Anthony Beaver, which is you have an old-fashioned card index, which has gone out of fashion now, but they're very useful things. You have one box for people, so everything Alexander Burns does, you put in there everything that, McNaughton with a top hat, or Elphinstone who fell off his horse, all those guys have their own set of cards. You have another for the main topics, Great Game, spies, espionage. And then you have a dateline on the computer. And as you read, you put in every event. And it starts off at 4 or 5 pages, and by the end it's often 300 or 400 pages. And you fill it all the quotes. So that by the time you, in a sense, it's a process like Chinese cookery. You spend years preparing the ingredients, chopping them all up so that they're all neatly ready, like lots and lots of nice spring onions and garlic and all your spices all waiting. And then once it's all ready, you can cook quite quickly. If everything's prepared, you've got all your quotes accessible, you know exactly what's happening on every day, you can write very quickly. And all 3 of these books, they're the big fat books, were written in 9 months.
That's incredible.
And like a Chinese cook, you fry it on a high heat.
I just want to go back to a bit of what you said. How do you know that the sun was shining, and what is that space between being historically and factually correct and then coloring it, filling it up with your own...
If you choose a story like this, you don't need to enhance it in any way. The story is so strong. And that's half the art, is to find the right story that has a tight group of characters, concentrated time frame. This happens only over 3 years. It begins in 1837, it closes in 1842. That's 5 years. The Last Mughal is set over 1 year. 1857 to 8. Yes, but if you have, if it's a thing like the 1857 or this, there are so many sources that if you wade through them and read them and organize them, you have all the detail you need. You don't need to make any detail up. Occasionally, there are moments when you want to know whether it's cold or hot or it's dark or sunshine, and there are, particularly in the Last Mughal, in White Moguls, which was a love story, there were crucial bits which were missing, which is very frustrating. Well, I still don't really know where Keralisa's grave is, for example. So you do occasionally come across gaps, but a big national event of huge importance like 1857 or 1842, it's all there, if you look. So many people. And it was a very ghoulish experience in some ways. What I haven't gone through here is what happens after the retreat. The British come back and they burn down Afghanistan. And they come back the following spring just as the snows are thawing. And they find that the troops who've been killed the previous January, many of them have their diaries or their last letters to loved ones in their jacket pockets. And they harvest these as they pass. They find the bodies. And so you order up in the British Library, Diary of Private Stapleton, 31st Regiment of Foot. And this thing arrives a couple of hours later in a plastic envelope. You open it up, and there's this thing covered in blood, which has been literally harvested by some other officer coming back in the army of retribution, this very fearsomely named force that have picked up these letters and these documents from the dead soldiers. And often they end in mid-sentence, or there's a bullet hole through one corner of it, and this guy never made it. But it's all there. And these were, and in the last 20 or 30 years, many of them have turned up in family attics. People have moved house and given it to the British Library or the National Army Museum in Chelsea.
We're short for time, so I'm just going to ask you the last question, which is moving away from some of your writing work. Can you tell us a bit about the exhibition that you did with the Asia Society a few years ago on painters and, I'm forgetting what it was called.
Princes and Painters in Mughal Delhi, 1707 to 1857.
Yes. And how was that interesting for you as a writer and so forth?
So these three history books, White Mughals, Last Mughal, Return of a King, actually take place in less than 50 years. White Mughals begins 1797. This is 1839 to 42, and Last Mughal is 1857 to 8. So it's quite a concentrated period. And I've always, that has become my little kind of my special zone. And I've always been interested in the art. And it seemed, and wherever you go in galleries and in people's homes, they always value the art of the high Mughals, but the late Mughals is forgotten. Now, everyone knows that the poetry of the late Mughals was great, Zafar and Ghalib and Zork and Mir and Darg and all that. And it seemed to me that the art was equally undervalued, that in fact there was extraordinary painting going on at the end, particularly in the period under Muhammad Shah Rangila in the 1740s, and again in this period of the twilight in Delhi, 1803 to 1857, when you have new European ideas of watercolor and European watercolor techniques and watercolor paper coming in, but you have the old Mughal artists doing it. Now, elsewhere people describe it as company school painting, which doesn't make any sense in Delhi because it's actually the Mughal artists. So we never use the phrase company painting in that exhibition. It's late Mughal painting. Although it's fusion painting because they're using foreign techniques and foreign paper, and it's very interesting. And this world is very mixed. It's this world of the white Mughals where Brits are dressing up as Indians and Indians are taking on Western ways, and there's a whole process of sort of social interaction. It's very interesting and very unwritten. And I find that's often the way with Indian history, that there are these periods which are fantastically well known, like the freedom struggle, like Akbar or Shah Jahan. But you only have to verge beyond those another 50, 60 years, and you're out in darkness. No one has written a great biography of Muhammad Shah Rangila, which is a crucial period when Delhi's in the,
liminal spaces of history.
Yeah. So there's these huge gaps between these famous bits. And that's where you can find new material and dig up new stuff.
And hopefully more William Dalrymple books.
Well,
thank you so much. We're short on time. And books are available outside. I'm sure William will be thrilled to autograph them. Two audience questions? Okay, you showed me it's a wrap, that's why. Two audience questions.
Yep.
One right here in the front and the gentleman at the back after that.
I read a report that you were invited to the White House to brief Obama's team and the CIA about this history and the White Mughals and everything. But there was no report on how they received it or did they learn any lessons from it. So can you just tell us a bit about that?
Classified information.
No, I don't think it is particularly. So it wasn't Obama himself. I would love to pretend it was, but he was in Mexico at the time. But I did get invited to the West Wing and did a presentation there much like the one you've had today. And it was exactly in a sense like you might expect. The people around the table were surprisingly young. Quite a few of them of South Asian origin. They were State Department, National Security, CIA, and the general AFPAC. There was a whole sort of civil service in the White House. as well as the main residential White House that you see on the telly and in films. There's the West Wing where the administration takes place, and then there's a whole office block next to it. And there's a whole floor of that office block entirely devoted to what they call AFPAC. And so there are all the different State Department, security, and so on. And the kids are often anything from, sort of 25 through to about 40. No one was older than that. And they were exactly as you'd expect. They're these hyper-achieving ex-Harvard, ex-Princeton, ex-Yale super nerds who knew everything about tribal politics, whatever their particular speciality was. But they had paper-thin understanding of the culture and the history beyond that. But I thought it was a good sign that they were inviting in historians. They apparently invited other people fairly regularly. And this is something that they do. And so, it seemed a good thing that they were bothering to get historians. Certainly, I'd never been asked to Downing Street or any briefing by my own country. Your Indian Army asked for a briefing, NATO have asked for one, and the White House. So, I don't know, there are obvious lessons to be learned from this, and the same mistakes are being made. The other person who read this and clearly and definitely has changed what he's been doing because of it is Karzai himself. And Karzai has grown up with this albatross of Shah Shuja. And he was given it when the Indian edition came out last December, and he'd read it by Christmas, and I got an invitation, and I went with my wife and kids to Kabul. And we got called in to this room where 3 Afghan presidents have been shot dead or hung or arrested. It's got a very grim building. One was killed on the stairs, one made it out to the lobby when each successive revolution took place. And Karzai is, in the position of someone who, could be in that position next year if everything goes wrong. Very clearly. And he gathered the whole cabinet, and we had this long discussion. Then I got called back again in Ramazan, and I had 7 hours with him, which ended up as the New York Times. It's on the New York Times website. I was interviewing him, and he was asking about this stuff. And no question, he has gone out of his way to avoid the mistake Shah Shuja made. And Shah Shuja's mistake, in his view, and in my view, was that he didn't allow clear water between himself and the Brits. Shah Shuja very loyally took the view that he had been taken in by the Brits in 1807 when he lost his kingdom, took their salt for 30 years, and he couldn't, however much he knew they were screwing everything up, and how idiotic Macnaghten was, he couldn't disassociate himself from them. Karzai has not made that mistake. And Karzai, for all his failings, has remained very popular in Afghanistan, and if he was allowed to stand for president again, would probably do so. Very interesting, in the last week, revelations have come from Bob Gates's book, that they are confessing that the Americans did try to fiddle the last elections. And everyone laughed at Karzai when he said that the deep state was working against him, and it turns out to be true. And I think he's a lot cannier and a lot cleverer than people have understood him to be. And I think the history will regard him sympathetically.
So are you saying in some ways that, to change the old cliche, history doesn't have to repeat itself and that we can learn tremendous things from it and not make the same mistakes?
The old cliche is that those who do not know history are destined to repeat it. But if you can learn lessons from the past... The other thing was Hegel's famous quote that the only thing you learn from history is that no one learns from history.
Last question.
Having read The Last Mughal, you've covered Delhi quite well in that, and in The White Mughal, you've covered Hyderabad very well, and give very small glimpses of what Madras was at that time. Can we then expect something from you in the next few years on Madras? Because I do believe the data on Madras is very rich, as Mr. Mutaya, a historian of the city, has put it. It is the first modern city, it's the first city of modern India. Can we expect something from you?
If I found a story, I love this place, and I love coming down here, and particularly this time of year when it's so cold in Delhi and it's gorgeous weather here. As you drive in from the airport, I owe Mr. Mutaya for this. As you drive in from the airport, next to the the church on the St. Thomas's Mount, there is a white domed tomb that the road swerves around, and that is the dome of Mughal-style tomb of Samuel Dalrymple. whose brother married a Nawab of Masulipatam and is married into sort of Madrasi. So there's lots of family history here. And there's lots of Dalrymple graves littered around the city, here and there.
And on that note, it's all in the family. Thank you very much, William. Thank you for a wonderful session.